Imagine a historian, right, handing you this meticulously detailed account of the fall of an empire.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And their very first claim to you before you even open the book is, I wasn't there. I didn't see any of this happen.
Right. Which is, a huge red flag usually.
Exactly. I mean, think about that for a second. Usually when we evaluate history, especially ancient history, our entire metric for truth is based on eyewitness authority.
Yeah, we want the person who is actually standing in the room.
Right. We validate an account by asking, were they there? Or at the very least, did they interview someone who saw the smoke and smelled the fire?
We operate on this core assumption that physical proximity to an event is the ultimate proof of its reality.
But then you step into the world of foundational civilizational texts, the kind of text people typically label as sacred history, and you encounter a text that takes that entire framework and just shatters it.
It intentionally dismantles the absolute reliance on the eyewitness.
Yeah, and that is exactly our mission today. We are completely dismantling how you, the listener, probably think about these kinds of texts. We're doing a deep dive into a highly analytical lecture by the thinker Ghulam Ahmad Parvez.
And this is such a fascinating source to dig into.
It really is. He takes a specific section of text Surah Al-Qasas, Ayat 44 to 47, and he dissects it by aggressively stripping away all the religious sentimentality.
All the mysticism and superstitions that usually cloud these discussions.
Exactly. We are looking at the nuts and bolts.
Because Parvez approaches the text not as a collection of magical bedtime stories or mystical legends, right?
Yeah.
He treats it as a masterclass in sociology and systems engineering.
Yeah, a diagnosis of civilizational collapse.
And to your point about the historian who wasn't there, that is precisely the paradigm shift this text introduces right off the bat.
Let's just look at the core paradox right out of the gate. In verse 44, the text explicitly denies the eyewitness status of the narrator.
It actively brags about it, almost.
It really does. It tells the listener, you were not on the western side when we decreed the matter to Musa, nor were you among the witnesses.
And then it just keeps repeating that refrain.
Yeah. Verse 45 is like, you did not dwell among the people of Midian. Verse 46, you were not at the site of the mount.
It is boasting about a lack of physical proximity.
Which is wild. If someone hands me a detailed structural breakdown of a historical event and proudly announces they were nowhere near it, my first instinct as an analyst is to ask, then what is the source of your data?
Right. Why make such a huge point of not being a witness?
Exactly.
Well, it's because the text is intentionally redefining the concept of authority for the reader.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
The authority of this historical account is not derived from eyewitness mysticism. It's not asking you to believe a story because someone had a magical vision.
Or because they have some perfect, unbroken memory of standing in the court of the pharaoh.
Right. The authority lies in the fact that this is transmitted, structured knowledge. The value of the history is entirely within its analytical content.
And the systemic laws it reveals.
Exactly. It's not about the physical geography of the person narrating it.
So it's essentially stating that the data must be objective enough to stand on its own merits, completely independent of the storyteller.
It's forcing the listener to look at the structural integrity of the information.
Rather than just the biography of the messenger. I love that. That sets a remarkably high-energy, purely rational tone for the rest of this discussion.
We are not dealing with a magical recall of the past here.
No, we are dealing with a decoded structural analysis of how human societies operate, how they build power, and how they inevitably destroy themselves when they violate certain systemic laws.
And to truly grasp the mechanics of what Parvez is extracting here, we really have to do a rigorous linguistic dissection.
Oh, definitely. The language is everything.
The source lecture emphasizes that the terminology utilized in the original Arabic is carefully chosen. It totally reframes our understanding of what the concept of revelation actually entails.
Because it's not some emotional or mystical download, right?
No, it is a highly specific data transfer.
Okay, so let's start with the title of the surah itself, Al-Qasas.
Yeah, this is a huge sticking point.
In almost every conventional translation you pick up, this is translated as the stories or the narratives.
Which immediately primes the reader to expect folklore.
Exactly. Fables, morality tales, whatever. But Parvez's linguistic breakdown paints a very different picture of that root word, doesn't it?
It does. Linguistically, qasas does not mean a fictional story or a fable. The Arabic word for fables or myths is actually kurafat.
Okay, so what is qasas then?
Qasas comes from a root that means to track, to follow a trail step by step.
Oh, wow. like a physical trail.
Yeah, picture a tracker in the desert looking at footprints in the sand. They deduce the weight, the speed, the direction of whatever passed through. That is Qasas.
That completely changes the vibe.
It means to provide a meticulously sequenced account. It treats history as a highly followable, logical record of cause and effect.
So it's basically a diagnostic sequence.
Exactly.
It's analyzing the footprints of a fallen civilization. It's saying, first, this specific economic policy was implemented.
Right, which caused the specific sociological division.
Which resulted in this inevitable systemic collapse. Man, that is the furthest thing from a fairy tale.
It's a structural post-mortem.
And the text pairs this concept of tracking with another crucial word, right? Naba.
Yes, Naba. Now, Naba is usually translated simply as news or tidings.
Like, here's the evening news.
Right, but in classical Arabic usage, particularly in this context, Parwez argues it's much closer to the concept of a high-level intelligence report.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just everyday gossip.
No, there is a totally different word for general news or rumors circulating in the marketplace, khabar. Naba is verified, actionable intelligence that has massive implications for the recipient.
It is data that requires a response.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're dealing with an intelligence report based on the forensic tracking of historical cause and effect. But I want to pause here and challenge this from the perspective of our listener.
Go for it.
Verses 44, 45, and 46 keep hammering this point. You were not there.
Yeah, the anti-eyewitness flex.
Right. So if the transmitter wasn't there, and they didn't interview anyone who was there, how can this intelligence report be considered verified?
It's a fair question.
How do you or I trust the data of a process we didn't observe?
Well, to answer that, we have to think about how complex systems analysis works in the modern world. How do we acquire objective knowledge about catastrophic events today?
Without relying on people who are standing in the middle of them.
Right.
I mean, I look at it through the lens of a forensic crash investigator, like someone from the National Transportation Safety Board.
That's a perfect analogy.
If a commercial airliner crashes, the lead investigator doesn't need to have been sitting in the cockpit while the plane was going down to know exactly, down to the millisecond, how the crash happened.
In fact, if they had been in the cockpit, they'd probably be dead.
Right. Or at the very least, their perception would be completely distorted by panic and sensory overload.
The investigator arrives days or weeks later, and they reconstruct a process they never personally observed by reading the structural data left behind.
Exactly. They read the telemetry data, the material stress fractures on the fuselage, the impact trajectory.
The spread of the debris field.
All of it. And the crucial point is this. We trust the forensic report far more than we trust the flawed, fragmented memory of some bystander who happened to see the plane fall from the ground.
Because eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable.
It's subject to emotional distortion, limited perspective, the degradation of memory. But structural data, the physics of the crash, does not lie.
And that is the exact mechanism the text is employing. The text is telling the recipient, I am handing you the forensic report of a civilizational crash.
You do not need to have been an eyewitness to the oppression of the pharaoh to understand the systemic laws that caused his empire to implode.
Right. The laws of societal friction, economic disparity, and psychological subjugation leave a debris field.
A debris field that can be tracked.
Yes, Qasas. And synthesized into actionable intelligence, Naba.
Man, this completely shifts the purpose of the transmission. If it's a forensic report, it has a functional utility.
And verse 46 explicitly states the purpose of this data transfer.
Oh, what does it say?
It says the intelligence is being given so that you may warn a people to whom no warner had come before them.
Okay, this brings us to the sociological context of the primary recipients, right? The Meccans of the 7th century.
Yes. From a historical and sociological standpoint, the Meccans were essentially a blank slate regarding these specific laws of civilizational rise and fall.
Right. Unlike the surrounding Byzantine or Sassanid empires.
Exactly. Those empires had long, complex histories of philosophical development and institutionalized statecraft.
They had access to earlier foundational texts.
The Meccans had not received this kind of systemic historical data yet.
They were mercantile capitalists, essentially. They had built this rapidly expanding, highly profitable oligarchy based on trade routes.
And the monopolization of the Kaaba as an economic hub.
Yeah, so they were becoming immensely powerful, but they were operating without a structural understanding of the fragility of empires.
They were vulnerable to the exact same hubris and systemic rot that had destroyed the civilizations that came before them.
They didn't need a magical story to entertain them around the fire.
No, they needed a functional transfer of decoded historical patterns. They needed to understand the blueprints of collapse so they wouldn't replicate the same catastrophic errors.
So the transmission of this text was basically an intervention.
A massive intervention. It was injecting crucial systemic data into a society that was hurtling toward its own apex.
Warning them that the laws of history apply to them just as strictly as they applied to the pharaoh.
And that leads us directly into the engine of reason driving this entire philosophy.
Yeah, the text uses the historical clash between Musa Moses and the pharaoh as its primary case study.
But, as Parwez points out, it presents this clash not as a holy relic to be worshipped.
Right, not as a mythical battle between a wizard and a king.
It's presented as a highly repeatable civilizational diagnosis.
It strips away the folklore and focuses entirely on the mechanics of tyranny.
Because the pharaoh in this text is not just a bad individual, he is an archetype of an unbalanced, oppressive socioeconomic system.
The text actually details his methodology, how he divided his people into castes, how he monopolized the economic resources.
And how he enacted a policy of psychological and physical subjugation.
Okay, let's look at that specific policy because it's brilliant from a grim systems engineering perspective.
It really is.
The text mentions Pharaoh killing the sons of the oppressed class and sparing their women. Traditionally, this is read as pure, bloodthirsty cruelty.
Like an evil cartoon villain.
Right. But from a sociological standpoint, it's a deeply calculated mechanism of control.
Because by eliminating the male youth, you destroy the future workforce's physical capacity for violent revolt.
Exactly. And by keeping the women alive, you maintain a continuous supply of domestic and reproductive labor for the ruling class.
It is the systemic destruction of a people's ability to sustain themselves as an independent entity.
It is the ultimate monopolization of human capital. And the text lays this out not to say, look how evil this one man was, but to say, this is the architecture of tyranny.
Recognize these structural indicators.
Yeah. When a society begins to violently divide its populace and extract labor while destroying the autonomy of the laborers, it has initiated its own countdown to collapse.
But for this intelligence report to be valid, the structural data it claims to track must be objectively verifiable.
Right. If this isn't a fairy tale, then the physical world should actually reflect the claims made in the text.
And this is where the source lecture brings in an incredibly fascinating external viewpoint to validate the structural integrity of the Naba.
Oh, this is the Maurice Bucaille connection.
Yes, Bucaille provides a perfect external validation of this concept of readable, objective history.
Because he was a French physician, right? A scientist operating entirely outside the theological framework.
Exactly. He applied modern analytical methods to the historical claims made in these texts.
And Bucaille, coming from a purely clinical anatomical background, analyzed the broader textual narrative surrounding the pharaoh.
And what he found is wild. He found that it precisely aligned with historical and scientific realities that were completely, absolutely unknown in the 7th century Arabian desert.
We really have to emphasize the vacuum of knowledge in 7th century Mecca regarding ancient Egypt.
Yeah, the civilization of the pharaohs had been dead for millennia by that point.
The hieroglyphics were unreadable. I mean, they wouldn't be deciphered until Champollion and the Rosetta Stone in the 19th century.
The Great Pyramids were partially buried in sand, and the royal tombs were sealed and hidden in the Valley of the Kings.
The knowledge of complex Egyptian mummification practices had completely vanished from the collective memory of the region.
It certainly wasn't circulating in the folklore of Meccan merchants.
Yet the wider Quranic narrative explicitly states regarding the pharaoh of the Exodus, a detail intrinsically linked to this Qasas, that his physical body would be preserved as a sign for future generations.
The statement made in an era where the idea of a king's body from thousands of years ago being physically preserved in a hidden crypt was medically and historically absurd.
It would have sounded like madness to the audience receiving the text.
And yet, centuries later, archaeologists unearthed the royal mummies.
And in the 1970s, Bucaille is given access to examine the mummy of Ramses II and Merneptah in Paris.
He conducts forensic medical examinations.
And he finds evidence of preservation that aligns perfectly with the transmitted intelligence report.
The physical debris field of the past matched the analytical data transfer of the 7th century.
Man, that is the crux of the argument right there.
It really is. Deniers of this systemic reality people who want to dismiss the text as just an amalgamation of ancient mythology or the uneducated ramblings of a desert merchant, they have to fall back on unproven assertions.
Because they simply refuse to engage with the structural data.
They cannot explain how highly specific, historically verified, and medically accurate intelligence regarding a buried civilization appeared in a text transmitted by someone who, as verse 44 explicitly states, was not among the witnesses.
The ruins of past civilizations aren't just old rocks for tourists to take pictures of, you know. They are the physical, empirical evidence of the systemic laws outlined in the text.
Parwes even points out that phenomena like the splitting of the sea are frames within this rationalist school, not as a magical wand-waving trick.
Right, not something that violates the laws of physics.
No, it's framed as a geographical tidal phenomenon, perhaps a retreating tide or a seismic event.
Something that operated perfectly within the bounds of physical reality, but occurred at the precise moment of systemic climax.
Because the physical world obeys its laws, and human societies obey their sociological laws.
The intersection of those laws is exactly what history tracks.
Which begs a massive question, actually.
Yeah.
If this text is actually a hyper-rational, historically verifiable, socioeconomic blueprint, why is it so rarely treated like one?
Oh, that is the million-dollar question. Why is it that when you look at how this history is taught, both in traditional religious institutions and in secular critiques, it is almost always reduced to spectacle?
It's all about the magic staff, the booming voice from the clouds, the fairy tale elements.
Why is it so much easier for humanity to consume this as magic rather than a manual?
Because, from a psychological and sociological standpoint, taking it as a fairy tale effectively removes all accountability from the reader.
Whoa, that is a profound diagnosis.
Think about it. If the collapse of the Pharaoh's empire is just a story about a localized magical event, if it's just a deity snapping their fingers in a fit of anger and an empire vanishes, then you, the listener, have zero skin in the game.
You just sit back in your chair, eat your popcorn, and marvel at the special effects.
Exactly. You think, wow, what an incredible, terrifying story about a very angry god. It has absolutely no bearing on how you live your life.
Or how you structure your society today.
You cannot replicate magic, and you cannot defend against it. Therefore, you are not responsible for it. It remains an isolated, anomalous event.
But if it's a sociological law, if the text is actually saying, here is the step-by-step mathematical progression of economic arrogance, political stratification, and the exploitation of labor that guaranteed the destruction of this society.
And this law is as immutable and universal as the law of gravity.
Well, then you have a massive immediate problem, because now you are forced to look at your own society.
A fairy tale provides entertainment and emotional catharsis. A sociological law provides an indictment.
Yeah. If you accept the text as a diagnostic sequence, you are suddenly responsible for auditing your own civilization.
Are we dividing our populace? Are we monopolizing resources?
Are we creating the exact same structural stress fractures that brought down the pharaoh?
If the law is universal, then the consequences are universal. To avoid the collapse, you have to fundamentally change your behavior.
You have to dismantle your own systems of power. And people in power, or people comfortable in their current system, will do absolutely anything to avoid doing that.
They will happily dress the text up in mysticism and lock it in a glass box labeled sacred relics.
Just so they don't have to read it as a manual for dismantling their own oligarchy.
Which is exactly why the text itself is intensely aware of this human tendency.
Oh, it calls it out.
It knows that humanity will actively try to avoid accountability by demanding magical proof instead of utilizing intellectual analysis.
And this leads to Parwes's exploration of a profound critique embedded within the text, the epistemology of sight versus insight.
How do we know what we know, and why do we refuse to know what is right in front of us?
The source material goes incredibly hard on this epistemological failing. It harshly critiques societies that demand physical, sensory proof for systemic, abstract concepts.
It also attacks societies that live entirely on blind tradition, a concept the text calls taqlid.
The text basically demands that humanity evolve past its animalistic reliance on immediate sensory input. It demands an escape from the biological state.
Let's talk about that demand for visual proof, because it's a recurring theme in these historical tracking reports.
Yeah, the text frequently references groups of people who demanded to see the source of the law unveiled.
They basically said to the transmitters, we refuse to believe in the systemic law of cause and effect unless you produce the lawgiver physically in front of us.
Show us the entity, and then we will follow the rules.
It is the ultimate failure of abstraction.
It really is. It's a fundamentally infantile way of interacting with reality. It would be like a modern CEO refusing to believe in the concept of market inflation because they can't physically see a giant monster called inflation walking down Wall Street.
You don't need to see the entity. You see the effects.
Exactly. You observe the purchasing power of your currency dropping, you see the supply chain constricting, and you deduce the systemic reality.
Demanding to see the lawgiver before obeying the law of civilizational survival is just asking for a magical shortcut to avoid intellectual labor.
Parwaz synthesizes the text categorization of people who operate with its infantile, sensory-dependent mindset, and the terminology used is shockingly blunt.
Oh, it pulls no punches.
The text states that human beings who possess the faculties of intellect, hearing, and sight meaning, the ability to gather data, analyze it, and project future consequences, but choose not to use them for critical analysis, are like cattle, nay, even more astray.
The specific Arabic term used is kalam.
Now, to a modern ear, that sounds like a petty insult, right? It sounds like the text is just name-calling its opponents.
But within the framework of sociology and systems analysis, this is actually a precise biological diagnosis, isn't it?
Absolutely. It is not an emotional insult. It is a statement of operational reality. Think about how a cow operates.
A cow functions purely on biological instinct and immediate sensory stimuli.
Right. It eats the grass in front of it. It sleeps when it's dark. It moves when prodded.
A herbivore will graze a field down to the absolute dirt, completely unable to abstract the concept of future scarcity or ecological collapse.
It cannot analyze the past to change its future behavior. It is trapped in the eternal present of its own biology.
Precisely. Now consider a human being. A human is endowed with complex cognitive architecture.
We can track history, Casas.
We can synthesize intelligence, Samba.
We can look at the ruins of a past empire and deduce the economic policies that destroyed it.
But if a human actively chooses to shut down those cognitive faculties,
If they prefer to just blindly follow the traditions of their ancestors, tackle it without questioning them,
or if they react only to the immediate sensory gratification of wealth and power, they have functionally downgraded their operating system.
they have uninstalled their higher order processing.
They're operating at the exact same systemic level as livestock.
And the text adds, nay, even more astray, because a cow is fulfilling its biological imperative.
A human acting like a cow is actively violating its potential and creating systemic danger for the entire herd.
And this choice to downgrade, this refusal to use insight, leads to a very specific terminal kind of societal blindness.
The source lecture discusses a concept that is critical to understanding this cognitive shutdown.
The concept of intoxication, right, or sukar.
Yes, when we hear intoxication, we immediately think of a bottle of liquor.
Sure, yeah.
But chemical intoxication is merely a localized, temporary, and relatively harmless version of the real danger the text is warning against.
The far more dangerous intoxication is systemic. It is the intoxication of unchecked power, of massive wealth accumulation, and of unchallenged ancestral tradition.
It is the intoxication of success.
Yeah, that's the killer.
When a society or a ruling class becomes immensely powerful and wealthy, that success acts as a powerful narcotic on the collective psyche.
It literally alters their perception of reality.
They become drunk on their own invulnerability. The elites look at their massive armies, their towering architecture, and their overflowing treasuries, and they lose the capacity for critical self-reflection.
The success itself becomes the proof that they can do no wrong. They think, we must be right, look how rich we are.
And a civilization operating in this state of deep intoxication cannot read the warning signs of its own collapse, even when the data is screaming at them.
Their analytical faculties are just offline.
The intelligence report, the NABA, can be sitting right on their desk,
Yeah.
detailing exactly how their supply lines are overextended and their lower classes are on the verge of revolt.
But because they are intoxicated by the status quo, their eyes are covered.
Think about how terrifyingly relevant this is to anyone listening to us right now.
Oh, completely. We are not just talking about ancient pharaohs and chariots. How often do modern, highly sophisticated institutions, massive multinational corporations, global financial institutions, entire governments operate with this exact same bovine, intoxicated mindset?
The 2008 financial crisis is a perfect modern analog.
Exactly. The data was there. The systemic rot in the subprime mortgage market was mathematically verifiable.
There were analysts waving the equivalent of the NABA in the air, saying, this structure is built on sand. It is going to implode.
But the institutions were completely intoxicated by their record-breaking quarterly earnings.
They were blinded by the immediate sensory gratification of the massive bonuses they were receiving that year.
They blindly followed the way we've always done it because the momentum of their success shut down their ability to project future consequences.
They operated purely on instinct, reacting only to what they could immediately extract in the present moment.
Exactly like the Kalanam, the cattle grazing the field down to the dirt.
They had the cognitive tools to avert disaster, but the intoxication of wealth rendered those tools useless.
Which sets them up perfectly, inevitably, for the fall.
And when that fall happens, when the structural stress finally exceeds the load-bearing capacity of the system and the empire buckles, the text introduces a concept that Parwes argues is the very core of this philosophy.
Right, he calls it the law of requital.
In the original terminology, mukafati amal.
This is where we dive deep into verse 47. And this concept is the hinge upon which the entire analytical framework turns, because it completely obliterates the traditional mythological definition of divine punishment.
The verse states that if a disaster were to strike a society because of what their hands sent forth, they would immediately complain, attempting to externalize the blame.
They'd say, "Our Lord, why did you not send us a messenger so we could follow your signs and be among the believers?"
The operative phrase in that verse is what their hands sent forth. This is the essence of the law of requital.
In this framework, societal disaster is not arbitrary. It is not an emotional outburst of divine wrath.
The Creator is not an angry king sitting on a throne in the clouds, hurling lightning bolts down at people who offended his ego.
It is purely mathematical.
It is the absolute, inescapable mathematics of cause and effect, action and reaction.
What their hands sent forth means that your society built a flawed, corrupt structure.
You engineered a system based on exploitation and inequality. Therefore, the structure collapsed on your head.
The collapse isn't an emotional punishment for your sins. It's the physical consequence of your poor engineering.
Parwes uses a brilliantly simple, undeniable analogy to explain this mechanic. The poison bottle.
I love this analogy.
Imagine you have a bottle of highly toxic arsenic. Printed clearly on the side of the bottle is a label that reads, "Poison. Handle with care. Consumption will result in death."
Now imagine someone looks at that bottle, decides to ignore the label because they are thirsty or simply arrogant, uncorks it, and drinks the poison.
The resulting death of that individual is not a punishment inflicted by the person who printed the label.
The manufacturer isn't sitting in a factory actively murdering the consumer out of spite.
No, the death is the systemic, inevitable consequence of the user's own action.
The poison did exactly what the chemistry of the poison dictates it will do. The biological system of the human body reacted to the toxin exactly as the laws of biology demand.
The result was pre-programmed into the action itself. That is mukafat yamal.
The requital is baked into the deed.
But notice the psychological reaction described in verse 47. When the poison takes effect, when the society begins to collapse under the weight of its own corruption, what is their immediate instinct?
They look for a loophole. They cry out, "Why didn't you send us a messenger? Why didn't someone warn us?"
It is the ultimate attempt to play the victim. We didn't know the rules, so it's not fair that we have to suffer the consequences.
And that exposes the brilliant, inescapable logical trap that the text has set from the very beginning.
Remember our breakdown of Qasas and Naba.
Right. By delivering this objective, structured intelligence report to humanity, the transmission completely removes the defense of ignorance.
Oh, this is the masterstroke. By giving them the forensic report of previous crashes, the text nullifies their only defense mechanism.
Exactly. If the warning label is clearly printed on the poison bottle and you have the cognitive ability to read it, you cannot sue the manufacturer from your deathbed claiming you didn't know it was lethal.
The delivery of the data transfers the totality of the responsibility onto the consumer.
Once the diagnostic record is delivered to your civilization, we didn't know, is permanently struck from the record as a valid excuse in the court of historical survival.
Verse 47 is essentially preempting humanity's favorite cop-out.
It's stating clearly, I am providing you with this decoded, objective history, specifically so that when your society inevitably fractures from its own internal arrogance and economic disparity, you cannot stand in the ruins and claim, if only someone had given us the blueprints, we would have built it better.
You had the blueprints. The intelligence report was sitting right on the table. You chose to read it as a fairy tale about a magic staff.
You chose the intoxicating comfort of your current wealth over the sober, difficult analysis of the historical record.
You acted like cattle, and now you are facing the slaughterhouse of history.
Man, the law of requital is terrifying precisely because it is so objective. It removes the psychological safety net of playing the victim.
It leaves you with nowhere to hide. It converts the pathetic excuse of "we didn't know" into the cold, harsh reality of "we refuse to look."
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire discussion and the most fiercely debated conclusion that Parwez draws from this framework.
Okay, let's get into it.
If the laws of civilizational survival are indeed objective, if they are mathematically knowable, and if they have been successfully and permanently transmitted via this readable record, what does that mean for the future of humanity's interaction with the divine?
Right. What happens to the concept of revelation?
Yeah.
This leads us to the concept of finality, the permanence of the transmitted text.
Within this specific socioeconomic and rationalist framework, the source text argues aggressively against the need for any new prophets, messengers, or mystical figures to arrive in the future.
The theological term is katan nubuwat, the finality of prophethood.
But Parwez frames it not as a mystical decree, but as a logical necessity of systems architecture.
Let's explore that systems architecture analogy because it makes this highly abstract theological concept incredibly grounded.
Think about software development. When you are building a massive, complex operating system, you have an initial R&D phase, research and development.
During this phase, you are writing the core code, you are testing it, you are finding bugs, and you are constantly pushing updates and patches to the users.
Right. In this historical framework, the entire era of the prophets, from Noah to Abraham to Moses to Jesus, represents that era of receiving the code.
It was the progressive transmission of the systemic laws as human society evolved in complexity.
But eventually, the core operating system reaches its finished state. The source code is complete.
The foundational text is finalized, immutable, physically preserved, and universally applicable.
Therefore, the prophetic era, the era of waiting for a new download of code from the server, is functionally and logically over.
It is redundant. If the manual for civilizational survival is mathematically complete and physically preserved in a readable record, which we established earlier is proven by the objective verifiability of the historical tracking, the Al-Qasas, then sending another messenger to deliver the exact same code serves no purpose.
The R&D phase is closed, the software is shipped.
Exactly.
So if the era of receiving the code is permanently over, what is humanity supposed to do? What is the current phase of the operation?
What remains is the phase of Risalat.
Break that down for us. What does that mean in practical terms?
Risalat, in this context, refers to the functional transmission and practical implementation of the existing code.
Okay, so doing the work.
Yes. The job of humanity is no longer to sit around waiting for a new message to drop out of the sky. The job is to take the intelligence report that is already sitting on our desks and actually implement its laws into our socioeconomic structures, our political systems, and our daily lives.
I have to say, as a listener processing this, that conclusion is both incredibly empowering and absolutely terrifying.
Terrifying in what sense?
Because the entirety of the burden has shifted. The responsibility now falls squarely and exclusively on the users of the text, us, the human race.
Yeah, that's heavy.
For thousands of years, humanity's default setting has been to wait for a savior. When tyranny gets too bad, when the economy crashes, when society fractures, people instinctively look up and hope a mystical figure will arrive on a white horse to magically repair the damage and punish the wicked.
It is the ultimate abdication of responsibility.
Exactly. But this framework violently severs that hope. It says, no one is coming to save you.
You don't get to sit in the ruins complaining that things are broken while hoping for a miraculous intervention.
You have the manual. You have the objective, historically verified, systemically sound manual that explains exactly how to build a society that doesn't collapse.
The code is in your hands. Now you have to do the grueling, unglamorous work of actually building it.
And that realization is the ultimate synthesis of this entire deep dive. The permanent, unyielding principle is that civilizational law is transmissible knowledge.
Over the arc of human history, the medium of that transmission has evolved.
It evolved from human messengers walking into the courts of kings to a preserved, portable, analytical, textual record.
The medium of the message changed, but the data, the mathematics of survival, is exactly the same.
Precisely. But, and this is the most crucial point to internalize, the responsibility that the transmission creates remains identical.
Delivering this text to a modern society creates the exact same moral and structural obligation as sending a living prophet to them.
The intelligence report has been delivered. If we choose to ignore it, if we choose to file it away as a book of ancient poetry or a collection of fairy tales, we guarantee the operation of the law of requital.
The poison bottle will still kill you, even if you refuse to read the label.
Let's recap the intense journey we've been on today. We started with a text, Surah Al-Qasas, that the world usually treats as sacred mythology, and following Parwez's analytical methodology, we completely stripped away the mysticism.
We analyzed it as a document deeply, obsessively concerned with historical tracking, the science of Casas, and the objective diagnosis of civilizational health.
We looked at the mechanics of tyranny, observing how systems of oppression don't collapse because of magic wands, but because they buckle under the weight of their own economic and social engineering.
We saw how the law of requital operates as pure cause and effect. Poor structural integrity in, societal death out.
We examined the text's harsh biological critique of societies that choose to operate like livestock, the Kalam blinded by the intoxicating narcotic of tradition and unchecked wealth.
Societies demanding to see physical magic, rather than applying the hard work of intellectual insight.
And we landed on the stark realization that this text insists its ultimate value is purely analytical and highly portable.
It functions as an intelligence report that forcefully converts the comfortable excuse of "we didn't know" into the cold, hard, indicting reality of "we refuse to look."
The source material we examine today does a ruthless, incredible job of stripping away the warm comfort we find in old fables.
It forces you, whether you want to or not, to look at the mechanics of the world you are living in right now.
It demands critical engagement. It is an engineering manual for societal survival, not a script for a morality play.
Exactly.
So, to you, listening to this, as you go back to your day, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over.
We've established that the historical data is already available to us. The blueprints have been delivered.
If the laws of civilizational rise and fall are as objective, measurable, and mathematical as the laws of physics, what disasters are we currently building with our own hands right now in our modern institutions, simply because we prefer the sleepy comfort of our modern myths over the harsh, demanding reality of the readable record?
Think about that the next time you hear a story and assume the warning only applies to a desert 3,000 years ago.